What would you do if the love of your life became your greatest betrayal? In a twisted tale of deception, one man's marriage crumbles as he uncovers a dangerous web of lies. His wife's secret lover isn't just after her heart. He's after everything. As the truth unravels, a shocking confrontation will leave no one unscathed. But when the dust settles, who will survive the ultimate betrayal? This is a story of trust shattered, of love pushed to its limits, and the dark consequences that follow.
Sometimes, the past clings to us in ways we don't expect, like a shadow that lingers just outside our vision, always present. Today, at 33, I've decided it's time to write about my relationship with Darcy. Not to reopen the wounds, but to close them for good. I've already filed a restraining order against her, and the need to make sense of everything has weighed heavily on me. In hindsight, what once seemed like a clear and simple story of love and loss was actually so much darker. This is my attempt to make peace with it, to find some satisfaction in putting it all behind me. Darcy and I met in the most unexpected way. We were working on a remote project together where long hours of professional exchanges slowly turned into something more personal, more intimate. At first, it was just emails, then phone calls, and before I realized it, those calls had become the highlight of my day. Each conversation left me with a fluttering anticipation, a pulse of excitement that I couldn't quite explain at the time. There was a chemistry between us, undeniable and potent. Even though our worlds were vastly different, hers of privilege and wealth, mine more modest, it didn't take long for us to fall into each other's orbit. I remember the first time we met in person after months of talking. The air around us felt charged, as though something significant had shifted. Her presence was magnetic. The way her eyes lingered on mine, the brush of her hand as she laughed at something I said, every little moment sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't long before we were dating, and within a year, we were married. But her family never really accepted me. From the very beginning, they saw me as less than an outsider, not wealthy enough, not polished enough. At first, I brushed off their veiled insults and cold stares, believing our love was strong enough to withstand anything. But as I now write these words, I realize how naive that was. Over time, those little jabs, the feeling of never being enough, became like cracks in a foundation. What I thought were minor inconveniences were, in fact, signs of deeper, more troubling issues. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. The tensions that slowly built between us weren't just about her family or their disdain. They were about something more fundamental. We were on a collision course, but I was too blinded by the rush of our early days to notice. I wanted to believe that love was enough to fix everything, that our connection would overcome the challenges. But now, with the benefit of distance, I can see how those first cracks would eventually become chasms. I'm not writing this to cast blame or find easy answers. Maybe I won't ever fully understand what went wrong, but I need to tell my side of the story. I need to find closure. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about love or heartbreak. It's a story about survival, about how we sometimes have to destroy the things we thought we needed most in order to save ourselves. Meeting Darcy was never something I planned, but destiny has a way of surprising you. It was during a remote project, long, impersonal work hours filled with emails and calls, that something unexpected began to happen. At first, it was professional, a routine exchange of ideas, but soon, each message carried a weight beyond the project itself. There was an energy in our conversations, a spark that seemed to flicker with every word she spoke. I found myself waiting eagerly for her voice, for that moment when we could connect, even if just for a few minutes. What started as business quickly turned personal. The boundaries blurred, and soon I was thinking about her in ways I shouldn't have, craving the sound of her voice, the laugh that spilled effortlessly through the phone, soft and intimate. Our exchanges became longer, more personal. She confided in me, shared pieces of her life, her past, and I did the same. Each confession felt like peeling back a layer, and before I knew it, I was drawn into her world in a way I never expected. When we finally met in person, the anticipation was palpable. I remember the moment vividly. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air feels alive with possibilities. She stepped out of her car, and for a second, I couldn't move. The way she looked, confident, her eyes sparkling with that same mischievous energy I'd grown to love over the phone. It was as if everything else around us faded away. I wasn't prepared for the pull she had over me. When she smiled, I felt it in my chest, like a weight pressing down, heavy with desire. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air between us, warm and floral, intoxicating. There was something so effortless about the way she moved, as if the entire world bent to her will. And when our hands finally touched, even briefly, the electricity between us was undeniable. It was as if, in that moment, I knew nothing would ever be the same. Despite how quickly things moved between us, it never felt rushed. Every step forward seemed inevitable, natural, like a current we couldn't fight even if we wanted to. We began to see each other as much as we could, stealing moments between busy schedules. And with each stolen moment, the connection between us deepened. Her laugh, the way her lips curved when she teased me, the way her fingers brushed against mine as we shared private jokes. Each interaction was a new thrill, an intoxicating dance that I couldn't resist. Yet, even in those early days, there was a part of me that sensed the differences in our worlds. Darcy came from wealth, from a life of luxury that I had never known. She lived in a world of private jets, high-end restaurants, and designer labels, while I was still finding my way, content with simpler things. But whenever I questioned how I would fit into her life, she would reassure me, her voice soft and soothing. None of that matters. What we have is all that counts. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that love could erase the gulf between us. And for a while I did. After a year of dating, we decided to marry. It was quick, but it felt right. Or at least it did back then. Her family, though, was another story. From the moment they met me, I could see the disappointment in their eyes. They judged me before I even had the chance to prove myself. I wasn't one of them. I never would be. To them, I was beneath her, unworthy of the life she deserved. Their comments were subtle at first. Offhand remarks about my career, my modest upbringing. But as time went on, they grew bolder, their disdain impossible to ignore. Darcy would brush it off, claiming that they didn't matter, that it was our life together that was important. But I could feel it, those cracks forming under the surface. Every cold look from her parents, every snide comment from her brother, it all began to take a toll. And while I tried to be strong, to tell myself that our love was enough to withstand it, there were moments, quiet, nagging moments, where I wondered if it ever could be. Still, in those early months, the thrill of being with her overshadowed the doubts. We were newlyweds, living in the haze of passion and desire that comes with it. Every night we spent together was a new discovery, a moment to lose ourselves in the heat of each other's touch. Her skin was always warm, her body soft beneath my hands. The taste of her lips, the sound of her breath as it quickened under my touch. These were the moments I lived for, the moments that made me forget everything else. But even as I write this, I know that those moments were fleeting illusions of happiness that couldn't last. I was blinded by my love for her, by the fire we shared. I couldn't see the cracks growing deeper, the fractures that would soon tear us apart. Everything changed when Darcy found out she was pregnant. The moment she told me, I felt like the world shifted beneath my feet, but in the best way possible. There was a brightness in her eyes I hadn't seen in months, as if the promise of this new life had rekindled something between us. The tension that had been growing, the cracks in our relationship, seemed to disappear, at least for a little while. We both believed that this child could be the glue that held us together, the foundation upon which we could rebuild what had started to crumble. I remember the way she looked at me that night, soft, vulnerable, and full of hope. I held her close, feeling the warmth of her body pressed against mine, her breath soft against my neck. For the first time in a long while, I believed we were going to make it. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into preparation. I wanted to give Darcy and the baby everything they could ever need. I imagined us as a family, building a life that was ours alone, away from the judgment of her family, away from the pressures that had been tearing us apart. I bought a new car, started fixing up the house, trying to make everything perfect. I wanted to show Darcy that I could provide, that I could be the man her family didn't believe I was. And for a brief time, it worked. We felt more connected than we had in months. Our nights together became softer, more intimate. I would come home from work, and we'd sit by the fire, her hand resting on her stomach, and I'd imagine the future we were about to have. Sometimes, in those quiet moments, I would lean over and kiss her belly, whispering to the life growing inside her. The feel of her skin, the scent of her hair, the way her fingers would trace circles on my arm as we talked late into the night. It all felt so right, so natural. But fate, cruel as it is, had other plans for us. I remember the night it happened. We had been out for dinner, a rare escape from the reality of our lives. Darcy looked radiant that evening, her cheeks flushed with the glow of pregnancy, her laughter light and easy. For the first time in a long while, it felt like we were just us again, free from the weight of expectations. But later that night, everything changed. I woke to the sound of her crying, the sheets beneath her stained with blood. My heart dropped into my stomach. I rushed her to the hospital, my mind spinning, trying to hold on to hope. But deep down, I knew. The doctor's words were a blur, but the meaning was clear. Darcy had lost the baby. The grief hit us like a storm. Darcy was inconsolable. She withdrew into herself, into a silence that I couldn't penetrate. I tried to comfort her, to hold her, but she pushed me away. I could feel her slipping further and further from me, retreating into a place where I couldn't reach her. Each day, the distance between us grew, and no matter what I did, it felt like I was losing her. The nights that had once been filled with warmth and intimacy became cold, empty. I would lie beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence stretch between us. Sometimes, I would reach out to touch her, but she would turn away, her body stiff, as if the mere thought of my presence was too much for her to bear. The connection we had, the spark that once ignited between us, felt like it had been extinguished. The loss of the baby wasn't just a physical one. It took a part of Darcy with it, a part of her that I would never get back. And though I tried to be there for her, though I tried to remain strong, there was a growing sense of helplessness inside me. I had no idea how to bring her back, how to bring us back. That night marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it at the time. I still clung to the hope that we could heal, that time would mend the wounds. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, it became painfully clear that the love we had shared was slipping through my fingers. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold on to it. I was losing her, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. After the miscarriage, everything between Darcy and me began to unravel, like a thread slowly pulled from the fabric of our lives until there was nothing left to hold us together. She became distant, detached, her once warm presence now cold and unreachable. Every attempt I made to comfort her, to bring her back to the woman I had fallen in love with, was met with silence or indifference. It was as though the person I had once known was disappearing before my eyes. Darcy began to pull away in small but undeniable ways. She spent more time alone, claiming she needed space, that she wanted her independence. At first, I gave her that space, believing that time would heal her wounds. But as the days stretched into weeks, it became clear that her distance was more than just grief. There was something else between us, something unspoken and heavy that neither of us could address. I remember the first real argument we had after the miscarriage. It wasn't over anything important, just some trivial detail of daily life, whether I had remembered to pick up groceries or forgotten to call someone back. But the tension in her voice, the sharpness in her tone, was new. It felt like a crack in the foundation of our marriage, one that was growing wider with every passing day. And with each fight that followed, Darcy would storm out of the house, slamming the door behind her without saying where she was going or when she'd be back. I would sit there in the silence after she left, staring at the empty space where she'd been, wondering how we had gotten here. The house, once filled with laughter and the warmth of shared moments, now felt hollow, echoing with the remnants of things unsaid. I began to dread the nights when the quiet between us became unbearable. She would slip into bed without a word, turning her back to me, her body a cold distance away. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of what we once had. The touch that had once set my skin on fire was now something I could no longer reach. The intimacy we once shared, those tender moments when our bodies spoke in ways words never could, had vanished. Every time I tried to reach out, to hold her, to close the gap between us, she would pull away. Her rejection was like a slow poison, seeping into the cracks of our marriage, making it harder and harder to breathe. I began to wonder if she even wanted to be touched by me anymore, if she could still feel anything for me at all. I tried to convince myself that it was just the grief talking, that this distance was temporary, that with time we would find our way back to each other. But deep down, I knew something had shifted irreversibly. Darcy wasn't just grieving the loss of our child. She was grieving the loss of us. Her family, never ones to waste an opportunity to twist the knife, began to insert themselves into our lives more frequently. They would visit unannounced, their eyes filled with pity whenever they looked at me, as though I were somehow responsible for all the pain Darcy was going through. The miscarriage was my fault in their eyes. They didn't say it outright, but their silences, their carefully chosen words, made it clear. They blamed me for the distance growing between us, for the fact that Darcy was slipping away. And the worst part? Darcy never defended me. She never told them to stop, never stood up for me when they accused me, either directly or through their insinuations. Every time we gathered with her family, I felt the weight of their disapproval pressing down on me, suffocating me. And Darcy, the woman who had once held my hand and promised me that nothing else mattered, simply watched in silence. The loneliness was unbearable. I had never felt more alone in my life, even with Darcy sitting right next to me. It was like she had built a wall between us, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't tear it down. Every effort I made to fix things, to talk, to reconnect, to bring us back to the place where we had once been, was met with resistance. She was slipping further and further away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I started to wonder if she had already given up on us, if, in her mind, we were already over, and she was just waiting for me to realize it. There were moments when I thought I saw it in her eyes, a kind of coldness, a distance that hadn't been there before. It scared me, because if Darcy had given up on us, then what was left for me? What was I fighting for? But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I told myself that if I just held on a little longer, if I just kept trying, maybe I could pull her back from the edge. Maybe I could save us. But deep down, a part of me already knew the truth. We were falling apart, and I was powerless to stop it. In a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of our marriage, Darcy and I agreed to try couples therapy. At first, the idea felt like a lifeline. One last chance to save the love that had once burned so brightly between us. I clung to the hope that these sessions would heal the wounds that had festered between us for so long. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The first few sessions were awkward, filled with silences that spoke louder than words. We both sat there, hesitant, unsure of where to begin. Darcy seemed distant, her gaze often fixed on the floor, her voice soft and detached. But there were moments, fleeting moments, where I could see a glimmer of something, perhaps a willingness to try, perhaps a memory of what we used to have. It was those moments that kept me going. As the weeks went by, the therapy began to work, at least on the surface. We started to communicate again, to speak about things that we had buried deep inside. There were still sharp edges between us, but now they were softened by the presence of a neutral party, someone to help us navigate the minefield we had created. For the first time in months, I felt like we were making progress, like there was still something worth saving. There was a night, not long after one of our sessions, when we sat together in the living room. It was quiet, just the two of us, the fire casting a soft glow over the room. Darcy had been withdrawn all day, but as we sat there, something shifted. She reached out, her fingers brushing against mine, tentative, as if testing whether the connection between us was still there. I turned to her, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging between us. Without a word, she leaned in, resting her head on my shoulder. My heart ached with the simplicity of that gesture, a reminder of the closeness we used to share. I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, we sat together, the silence no longer filled with tension, but with a fragile kind of peace. Her body against mine felt familiar, comforting. I could feel the rise and fall of her breath, the warmth of her skin. It was a quiet, tender moment, one that I had almost forgotten we were capable of. That night, we went to bed together, and for the first time in months, she didn't turn away from me. We lay there in the dark, the space between us smaller than it had been in so long. I reached out, my fingers tracing the curve of her hip, hesitant at first, unsure if she would pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she turned toward me, her breath warm against my neck, her body curling into mine. It was slow, tentative, like we were relearning each other's touch, each movement a careful step toward something we had lost. Her lips brushed against mine, and for a moment, I forgot all the hurt, all the distance. In that kiss, I felt a flicker of the passion that had once consumed us, a reminder of the love that had brought us together in the first place. It was bittersweet, because as much as I wanted to believe this was a turning point, there was a part of me that knew it wasn't enough. Still, I held on to her that night, clinging to the fragile hope that we could still find our way back. In the days that followed, there were more moments like that. Small, delicate steps toward rebuilding the intimacy we had lost. Darcy stopped leaving the house after our arguments. The silences between us, though still present, became less oppressive. There were nights when we would sit together, our hands intertwined, and I would let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we were healing. But even as things seemed to improve on the surface, there was an undercurrent of doubt that I couldn't shake. No matter how much I wanted to believe we were fixing things, there was a part of me that knew we were only scratching the surface. The deep, festering wounds between us hadn't healed. They had just been covered up, hidden beneath the fragile veneer of progress. And then there was the feeling I couldn't ignore. Darcy was still distant in ways I couldn't explain. Even when we were together, even when she smiled or laughed, there was something missing, a part of her that I could no longer reach. It was as if she was playing a role, pretending that everything was fine, when deep down, we both knew it wasn't. I could sense it in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes would drift away during conversations, as if she was somewhere else entirely. It was in those moments, when I saw the flicker of disconnection in her eyes, that my doubts began to grow. What if this was all just temporary? What if the progress we were making was nothing more than a performance, a desperate attempt to salvage something that was already gone? There was a part of me that didn't want to face the truth. I wanted so badly to believe that we could fix this, that love would be enough to overcome everything we had been through. But deep down, I knew the connection we had once shared was still broken, still fragile. And no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart again. I held on to the hope for as long as I could, but hope, like everything else, has its limits. I'll never forget the day I saw Darcy with him. It was one of those moments that changes everything, when the ground beneath you shifts and the world you thought you knew collapses in an instant. It happened by chance, a cruel twist of fate. I hadn't planned to be in that part of town, and certainly not at that exact moment. But there I was walking past a restaurant when I saw them through the glass window. Darcy was sitting across from a man I didn't recognize. At first, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he was just a friend, a colleague. But something in the way she looked at him, in the way her hand brushed against his, made my stomach turn. It was an intimacy I hadn't seen in her for months, a look she hadn't given me in what felt like an eternity. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. I watched them, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. They were laughing, talking quietly, leaning into each other in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. It was as if I didn't exist, like everything we had been through, every moment we had shared, was meaningless. I stood there, hidden from view, my mind spiraling. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation, but deep down I knew better. There was a history in the way they interacted, something that couldn't be explained away by coincidence or friendship. It was in the way she smiled at him, a smile that I hadn't seen in months, the kind of smile she used to reserve for me. I didn't confront her. I couldn't. Instead, I walked away, my head spinning, my body trembling with a mixture of anger, confusion, and a sickening sense of betrayal. For the next few days, I was consumed by thoughts of them. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? Was this the reason for her distance, for the coldness that had seeped into our relationship? Every moment we had spent together in recent months felt like a lie, tainted by the knowledge that she was giving a part of herself to someone else. I couldn't let it go. I needed answers. I needed to know who he was and what was really happening between them. So I began to dig. I asked around, did some research, and soon I had a name, Derek. He wasn't just a fling or a casual lover. He was something far more dangerous. The more I learned about him, the worse it got. Derek wasn't just some charming stranger who had swept Darcy off her feet. He was a con artist, a man who made a living by seducing women, gaining their trust, and then draining them of everything they had. He preyed on vulnerability, on the fragile emotions of those who were lost, just like Darcy. He wasn't just after her heart. He was after her money, her life, everything she had to offer. I felt sick. The betrayal was deeper than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just that Darcy had found someone else. She had fallen into the arms of a predator, a man who was using her, manipulating her, and she didn't even know it. All the time I had spent trying to save our marriage, trying to reconnect with her, she had been slipping further into his trap. And yet a part of me felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the coldness that had crept into her touch. It all made sense now. Darcy wasn't just distancing herself from me. She was being consumed by someone else, someone who had no intention of loving her, no intention of being there for her. The realization hit me like a wave, both painful and strangely liberating. I had spent so much time blaming myself, wondering what I had done wrong, why I hadn't been enough for her. But now I saw the truth. It wasn't me. It was her. She had made the choice to betray me, to fall into the arms of a man who would only destroy her. But even in my anger, there was something else, an overwhelming sense of pity. She didn't know. She didn't realize what she was getting herself into. She thought she had found solace in him, an escape from the pain of our marriage. But all she had found was more suffering. And when the time came, when Derek had taken everything from her, she would be left with nothing. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more time, more proof. If I went to her now, she would deny everything, twist the truth, make excuses. I had to be smart, patient. So I began to watch, to gather evidence. I tracked her movements, followed the patterns of her absences, and with each passing day, my suspicions were confirmed. Darcy was caught in his web, and I was going to be the one to tear it apart. After the initial shock of seeing Darcy with Derek, my mind was set on one thing: uncovering the truth. I couldn't let it fester any longer. I needed to know everything about the man who had stolen not only my wife's attention, but her entire life. So, I started digging deeper, and the more I found, the darker the story became. I reached out to a friend of mine who worked in cybersecurity. His skills were discreet, and I trusted him completely. I didn't tell him everything, just that I needed information on a man who was involved with my wife. The less he knew, the better. Within days, he had compiled a file on Derek, and what I discovered shook me to my core. Derek wasn't just a charming stranger who had swept Darcy off her feet. He was a professional, a predator. He'd perfected his technique over years, luring vulnerable women into his web with sweet words and promises of a new life. The file was thick with records of his past cons, women who had lost their savings, their homes, even their identities to him. He'd create an illusion of romance, of passion, and then slowly drain them of everything they had. He was slick, calculated, and utterly ruthless. Each new piece of information added fuel to the fire burning inside me. This man wasn't just taking Darcy from me. He was taking her entire life apart, piece by piece, while she had no idea what was happening. The realization of how deeply she was trapped with him made my skin crawl. I wanted to storm in, confront them both, expose Derek for the fraud he was. But I knew better. This wasn't just about my pride or our broken marriage anymore. It was about stopping him before he ruined her completely. My friend and I kept digging, tracing Derek's steps, his financial records, his movements. He had been methodical in covering his tracks, but nobody is perfect. There were gaps, small inconsistencies that revealed his patterns. Each transaction, each call, each meeting was part of a carefully orchestrated scheme, but we were starting to piece it together. I began following Darcy more closely. Every time she left the house without explanation, I knew exactly where she was going. At first, it was hard to watch. Seeing her meet Derek, seeing her so wrapped up in the illusion he had created. They would sit together in quiet corners of restaurants or cafes, leaning into each other like lovers, her eyes filled with the kind of affection she no longer showed me. But what struck me the hardest wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that she had no idea what he was doing to her. She looked at him like he was her savior, her escape, and all the while, he was slowly dismantling her life, preparing to take everything from her. I wanted to shout at her, to shake her out of the days she was in, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to be patient, to let Derek dig his own grave. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, the weight of what I had uncovered pressing down on me. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how we had come to this. The woman I had loved, the woman I had promised to spend my life with, had fallen into the arms of a monster, and I was powerless to stop it, at least for now. But there was also a strange, twisted satisfaction in knowing more than she did. I watched from the shadows, gathering every piece of evidence, every lie, every manipulation. I could feel the power shifting. For months, I had been the one in the dark, confused, heartbroken, trying to make sense of her distance. Now I was the one with the upper hand. Derek might have been a master manipulator, but he didn't know who he was up against. As the days passed, I became more certain of my plan. I wasn't going to confront them until I had everything I needed. No loose ends, no room for doubt. I wanted to expose Derek for what he was, not just to Darcy, but to the world. I wanted to make sure that he couldn't just disappear and move on to the next victim. And so, I waited, watching their every move, gathering every bit of information I could. Darcy's visits with Derek became more frequent, and so did her lies. She would come home late, offering flimsy excuses about work or seeing friends, the guilt barely hidden behind her words. I played along, pretending not to notice, pretending to believe her. The hardest part wasn't the lies. It was knowing that, deep down, she was still in love with him, still believing in the fantasy he had created for her. Even after everything we had been through, she was choosing him. And for what? For a man who would leave her with nothing. But my patience had its limits, and I knew the moment of reckoning was coming. Derek was getting sloppy, too confident in his ability to keep her under his spell. He had no idea I was watching, that every move he made was being tracked. The satisfaction of knowing his downfall was inevitable kept me going. This wasn't just about saving Darcy anymore. It was about exposing the truth and making sure Derek never did this to anyone else again. I had the proof. All I needed was the right moment. I knew I couldn't rush it. As much as every part of me ached to confront Darcy, to tear down the web of lies she had spun, I had to be patient. The plan needed to be perfect. There couldn't be any mistakes, any room for doubt. This wasn't just about exposing Derek. It was about making sure he couldn't escape, couldn't disappear before the consequences caught up with him. And Darcy, she needed to see the truth for herself, in a way that left no room for denial. So I continued to play my part. I let Darcy believe I was still the clueless husband, blind to her betrayals. I pretended not to notice when she left the house without explanation, acted indifferent when she came home late, her face flushed from her time with Derek. Each time she lied to me, it only solidified my resolve. The satisfaction I felt, knowing I was one step ahead of her, kept me going. While Darcy fell deeper into Derek's clutches, I was busy behind the scenes, building my case against him. Every piece of information my friend uncovered was another nail in Derek's coffin. The financial records, the transactions, the aliases he used. It was all there, laid out in front of me like a twisted puzzle. I had enough to destroy him, and I knew that once Darcy saw the truth, she would have no choice but to confront the reality she had been ignoring for so long. But gathering the evidence wasn't enough. I needed a plan, a moment where everything would come to light, where Darcy would be forced to face the man she had given herself to, and where Derek would have no way out. It had to be public, undeniable, something that would leave them both with no choice but to deal with the fallout. I waited for the right opportunity, and then it came, almost as if fate had delivered it to me on a silver platter. Darcy and Derek had planned a weekend getaway, an escape from the world where they could indulge in the fantasy they had built together. She told me it was a business trip, but I knew better. I had seen the reservations, the romantic cabin hidden away in the mountains. It was the perfect setting for their little affair. It was also the perfect setting for everything to come crashing down. I didn't confront her when she packed her bags, offering me a half-hearted excuse about an important client meeting out of town. I didn't flinch when she kissed me goodbye, her lips barely brushing against mine, as if I were nothing more than an afterthought. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and wished her luck. Inside, the fire of anticipation burned hotter than ever. Once she was gone, I set everything in motion. My friend had already traced Derek's movements, and I knew exactly where they were headed. The remote cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. It was supposed to be their sanctuary, their escape from reality, but it would soon become the stage for their undoing. The night before they were set to leave, I finalized my plan. Every piece was in place. My friend had arranged for the evidence to be delivered to the authorities, ensuring that Derek wouldn't be able to slip away once the truth was revealed. I had arranged for a private investigator to be there to capture every moment, every lie, every betrayal. There would be no running from this. I followed them to the cabin, careful to keep my distance. The cold mountain air stung my face as I watched from the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. They arrived just as expected, laughing and holding hands, completely unaware of what was about to happen. From my vantage point, I could see everything. The way Derek held her, the way she looked at him with that same adoration I had once seen in her eyes for me. It made my stomach turn, but I held my ground. This wasn't about my jealousy anymore. This was about justice. The hours crawled by, each moment building the tension inside me. I watched as they settled into the cabin, their evening unfolding like a twisted dream. They drank wine by the fire, their laughter filling the silence of the woods. It was almost too perfect, too idyllic, as if they believed they could live in this fantasy forever. And then, as night fell and the cabin lights dimmed, I made my move. I waited until they were in the bedroom, until the house was quiet and their guard was down. My heart raced as I approached the door, every step bringing me closer to the moment I had been waiting for. The investigator was with me, his camera ready to capture everything. I knocked, the sound echoing through the still night. There was a pause, then footsteps. The door opened, and there she was, Darcy, wrapped in nothing but a silk robe, her eyes wide with shock as she saw me standing there. Behind her, Derek appeared, his expression quickly shifting from confusion to alarm. He hadn't expected this. Neither of them had. "Hello, Darcy," I said, my voice calm, controlled, despite the storm raging inside me. "We need to talk." Darcy's face paled, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words. She glanced back at Derek, who stood frozen, his confidence melting away under the weight of my presence. This was it, the moment of reckoning. I stepped inside, the investigator following close behind, his camera already capturing every second. Darcy's eyes darted from me to Derek, her mind racing to understand what was happening. "I know everything," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "About you, about Derek, and about what he's been doing to you." Derek started to speak, his voice filled with feigned innocence, but I cut him off. "Save it. I've got everything I need to expose you. Every lie, every con. You're not going to get away with it this time." Darcy looked at me, her face crumbling as the realization hit her. She turned to Derek, her voice trembling. Well, what is he talking about? Derek tried to pull her close, his words smooth, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Don't listen to him, Darcy. He's just trying to come between us. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. The room felt like it had frozen in time. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. Darcy stood there, her face pale, eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Derek, once so confident, was now reduced to nothing more than a trapped animal, his eyes darting between us, looking for a way out. I stepped further into the room, my voice calm, but inside, I was burning with a rage that had been building for months. I have all the evidence, I said, fixing my gaze on Derek. Your frauds, your scams, your entire history of preying on women like Darcy. It's over. The investigator stood just behind me, his camera capturing every moment, every flicker of fear on Derek's face. Darcy, meanwhile, looked like she was on the verge of collapse, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. She turned to Derek, her voice trembling, barely more than a whisper. What is he talking about? Is it true? For a moment, Derek hesitated, his polished facade cracking under the weight of the truth. But then, with a sickeningly smooth smile, he tried to regain control. He stepped toward Darcy, reaching for her, his voice a quiet plea. Darcy, don't listen to him. He's lying. He's just trying to come between us. But it was too late. I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes, the cracks in the fantasy she had been living. She looked at me, searching for answers, but I had none to give her. Instead, I handed her the file, the thick, damning folder of evidence my friend had compiled. Look for yourself, I said, my voice heavy with finality. This is the man you've been giving everything to. Darcy's hands trembled as she took the folder, flipping through the pages, her face growing more ashen with each new revelation. The images, the financial records, the testimonies from other women who had fallen victim to Derek's charm. It was all there, laid bare in front of her. I watched as her face shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to horror. How could you do this? She whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked up at Derek, her eyes brimming with tears. The hurt in her voice was raw, exposed, and for the first time in months, I saw the real Darcy, the woman I had once loved, now broken by the truth. Derek's mask of calm shattered in an instant. His eyes darkened, and the smooth charm he had used to manipulate her for so long disappeared, replaced by cold, calculated anger. Don't be stupid, Darcy, he snapped, his voice harsh and cutting. You wouldn't have anything without me. You needed me. I stepped forward, my body tense, ready to intervene, but Darcy held up a hand, stopping me. She turned to Derek, her voice shaking, but filled with a new resolve. You lied to me. You used me. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, I saw Derek for what he truly was, small, desperate, and powerless. His eyes flickered toward the door, as if weighing his options, but he knew he was trapped. There was no escaping this. I loved you, Darcy said, her voice cracking with the weight of her betrayal. I trusted you. Derek sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Love? Trust? Don't be naive. You were convenient. That's all. The words hit her like a slap, and I could see the last bit of light drain from her eyes. She dropped the folder, the papers scattering across the floor like pieces of a shattered dream. And in that moment, something inside her seemed to break. She took a step back, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I moved toward her, instinctively, wanted to protect her, to shield her from the pain that was washing over her. But Darcy shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice hollow. I thought he loved me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw Darcy for what she was, a woman who had been used, manipulated, and broken. She wasn't the cold, distant figure I had grown to resent. She was lost, confused, and utterly destroyed by the realization that everything she had believed in was a lie. I reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. It's not your fault, Darcy, I said quietly. You couldn't have known. He deceived you, like he did with all the others. But Darcy didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the floor, her body trembling with the weight of her betrayal. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the soft rustle of the papers scattered at her feet. And then, without warning, Derek made his move. He lunged toward the door, his eyes wild with desperation, but he didn't get far. The investigator, anticipating the attempt, blocked his path, grabbing him by the arm and holding him in place. "It's over, Derek," I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "The police are on their way. You're not going anywhere." Derek struggled for a moment, his face twisted in fury, but he knew he was beaten. There was no escaping the trap he had fallen into, no more lies to hide behind. He was finished. I turned back to Darcy, who hadn't moved. Her eyes were still fixed on the floor, her body tense, as if she were trying to hold herself together by sheer willpower. I wanted to say something, to offer her comfort, but I didn't know how. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Minutes later, the police arrived, and Derek was taken into custody. I watched as they led him away in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. He didn't look back at Darcy, didn't say a word to her. He was done with her, just as he had been done with every other woman he had conned. And as I stood there, watching the aftermath of everything I had uncovered, I realized something. I didn't feel victorious. There was no triumph in this moment, no sense of satisfaction in seeing Derek taken away. All I felt was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Because while Derek had been exposed, while the lies had finally come to light, the damage had already been done. Darcy and I were broken, perhaps beyond repair. And no matter how much I had wanted justice, no matter how much I had needed to expose the truth, it couldn't change the fact that we had lost each other long before any of this had happened. As the police car disappeared into the night, I turned to Darcy one last time. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears, her face etched with sorrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. I nodded, but I didn't know what to say. There was nothing left to say. And with that, I turned and walked away. The days following the confrontation were a blur, filled with the kind of numbness that comes after a storm has passed, but leaves devastation in its wake. Derek was gone, taken into custody, his crimes exposed for the world to see. But with his departure, there was no sense of closure, no relief. The damage he had caused was far greater than I had anticipated. Darcy and I were left standing in the wreckage of what had once been our marriage, unsure of how to move forward, or if there was even anything left to salvage. Darcy didn't come home right away. After that night at the cabin, she disappeared for a while, staying with friends, perhaps trying to make sense of her own role in everything. I didn't press her for answers. I didn't need to. The silence between us spoke volumes. We were both too broken, too raw, to face each other. The truth had been laid bare, and now there was nothing left but to pick up the pieces, or walk away. When she finally did return, it wasn't with words of reconciliation. Instead, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared so many moments, and placed a stack of papers in front of me. Divorce papers. It shouldn't have surprised me. In fact, part of me had expected it, even wanted it. But seeing those papers, seeing the finality of it all laid out so coldly in black and white, still hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at them for what felt like hours, the weight of the past months crushing down on me. This was it, the end. No more trying to fix things. No more hope of repairing what had been broken. "I'm sorry," Darcy said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her hands, avoiding my gaze. For everything, I didn't respond right away. What was there to say? I had spent so long chasing after answers, trying to understand why we had fallen apart. But now, sitting here with the divorce papers in front of me, none of it seemed to matter. The why didn't change the fact that our marriage was over. "I don't blame you," I finally said, my voice flat, emotionless. And it was true. I didn't blame her, not anymore. Maybe I had in those early days of anger and confusion. Maybe I had spent sleepless nights resenting her for choosing Derek, for betraying me. But now, After everything we had been through, I could only feel pity for both of us. We were victims, in our own ways, of a relationship that had gone wrong long before Derek entered the picture. Darcy nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, but she didn't try to wipe them away. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. I thought I could escape everything, but I ended up losing more than I ever thought possible." I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. Darcy had been lost, just as I had been, and in her desperation, she had reached for the wrong solution. We had both made mistakes, both let the cracks in our relationship grow until they were too big to fix. Derek had only been the final blow. I picked up the pen, my hand shaking slightly, and signed the papers. As I did, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It wasn't the kind of relief that comes from victory or resolution, but rather the relief of finally letting go of something I had been holding on to for far too long. The weight of our marriage, the pain, the betrayal, it was all too heavy to carry anymore. This was the only way forward. Darcy watched in silence as I signed the last page, her tears still falling. When I was done, I slid the papers back toward her. She didn't say anything, just nodded, as if acknowledging the finality of it all. The divorce process itself was just as draining as I had expected. There were financial details to sort out, assets to divide, and of course, the lingering mess left behind by Derek. While I had made sure that most of his cons hadn't affected me directly, Darcy wasn't so lucky. She had fallen for his lies completely, and the financial consequences were brutal. Debts, fraudulent investments, and promises that had left her with nothing but empty accounts and broken trust. Her family, never ones to miss an opportunity to place blame, tried to shift responsibility onto me. They claimed that I should have done more to protect Darcy, to prevent her from falling into Derek's trap. But I didn't let it get to me. The truth was out now, and no amount of finger-pointing could change that. I had done what I could, and Darcy had made her choices. Still, as the weeks dragged on, it became clear that Darcy would be left with almost nothing after the divorce. Derek had taken most of what she had, and with her family no longer willing to support her, she was adrift. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to leave her completely abandoned. I negotiated to leave her with a fair share of what little we had left. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her to start over, to rebuild. When the papers were finally signed and the legal process came to an end, there was no dramatic goodbye. Darcy and I had already said all there was to say. We had reached the end of our story, and there was no point in dragging it out any longer. She left the house quietly, her suitcase in hand, and I watched her go from the window. There was no bitterness, no anger, just a deep, aching sadness. Our marriage, once filled with love and hope, had withered away, leaving behind only the ghost of what could have been. For the first time in years, I was alone, truly alone. And as I stood there in the silence of the empty house, I realized that maybe, just maybe, that was what I needed. After the divorce, life felt eerily quiet. The house, once filled with the sounds of Darcy's laughter, our shared moments, and even the tense silences that had marked our decline, now stood empty. I hadn't realized how much space she had occupied in my life until she was no longer there. At first, the silence was unbearable. Each room echoed with memories I wasn't ready to face, reminders of what we had been and what we had lost. But slowly, the quiet became something else, something almost comforting. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, I had the space to breathe, to reflect without the constant pressure of trying to hold everything together. There was no more pretending, no more struggling to fix a broken relationship. It was over. And with that finality came a strange sense of freedom. In the weeks that followed, I began the process of rebuilding, both my life and myself. It wasn't easy. The wounds left by Darcy's betrayal, by Derek's manipulation, were still fresh, still raw. There were days when I woke up feeling like a part of me had been hollowed out, like I had lost something essential. But there were also days when I felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of a relationship that had been dragging me down for so long. I found myself rediscovering the small things I had neglected during the chaos of my marriage. I took long walks through the city, soaking in the sights and sounds that I had once been too distracted to notice. I reconnected with old friends, people I had pushed away while trying to navigate the mess that my life had become. It wasn't a quick or easy process, but slowly, piece by piece, I began to feel like myself again. Darcy tried to contact me a few times after the divorce, but I didn't respond. Not out of anger or resentment, but because I knew there was nothing more to say. We had said our goodbyes, signed the papers, and now it was time for both of us to move on. Holding on to the past, to the pain, wouldn't help either of us. I thought about her sometimes, wondered what she was doing, if she was okay, if she had managed to rebuild after everything that had happened. Derek's betrayal had left her shattered, and I knew it would take time for her to heal. But I also knew that her healing was no longer my responsibility. For the first time in years, I was free to focus on myself, on my own future. The nightmares about Derek faded too. In the beginning, I had dreams of him, of the lies he had told, the way he had manipulated Darcy, and the chaos he had caused in our lives. But with time, even those memories began to fade. He was gone now, locked away where he couldn't hurt anyone else, and the hold he had over me, over us, was finally broken. As the months passed, I began to make peace with everything that had happened. The pain of betrayal, the collapse of my marriage, even the feelings of failure that had haunted me. All of it became part of my past, something I could look back on without being consumed by it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. I was just tired. Tired of holding onto the weight of something that no longer existed. I had survived. That was the most important thing. I had survived the lies, the heartbreak, the loss of everything I thought I had known. And now, on the other side of it, I was stronger for it. Not hardened or jaded, but wiser. I knew now that some things, no matter how much you want to save them, are meant to end. And that's okay. One evening, as the sun set outside my window, casting a golden glow over the room, I sat down at the table with a glass of wine and reflected on everything that had happened. There was a quietness in me now, a calm acceptance of the way things had unfolded. Darcy had been a part of my life, an important part, but she was no longer my future. She was a chapter in my story, one that had ended, but not without teaching me valuable lessons about love, trust, and most of all about myself. I took a sip of wine and smiled, just a little. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing that you've made it through the worst and come out the other side still standing. The future was uncertain, and I didn't have all the answers. But I knew one thing. I was ready to face whatever came next. Without the weight of the past dragging me down, without the shadows of Derek and Darcy haunting my every step, I was free to move forward. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. I stood up and opened the window, letting the cool evening air wash over me. The world outside was still moving, still alive, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was a part of it again. The pain, the betrayal, the loss, it was all behind me now. It was time to start living again.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.